This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
A lot of what the U.S. has tried to get done around the world recently seems to have gone sour. President Trump's love for tariffs and disdain for NATO have drained any remaining goodwill from his counterparts in Europe. And although U.S. and Israeli airstrikes quickly killed Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in late February, he was succeeded by his son, who is 30 years younger and every bit as much the hardliner. Probably to President Trump's chagrin, all this bad news has pushed a successful act of U.S. aggression out of the spotlight.
An assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice.
From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. There are plenty of Americans who think the United States should not have nabbed the sitting president of Venezuela and sent him to New York to await trial on drug charges. But as my guest will explain, it's hard to argue that the operation to remove Nicolas Maduro didn't go off as U.S. planners intended. The question now for oil investors, for democracy advocates, and for the people of Venezuela is what next? Missy Ryan is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where you can read her article, Venezuela Seems to Be Going Well. Missy, welcome to Think.
Thank you.
I will note that the question mark in my voice came from the headline. That is not my editorial addition. You note that, President Trump's critics were aghast when word came down about U.S. troops nabbing Maduro from Venezuela in early January. Remind us, if you will, of what made that operation so shocking for many observers.
Yeah, so the lead up to the operation was, there was a lot of foreshadowing, let's say, to what happened in early January. And there was this huge naval buildup. There was a lot of hints that the Trump administration was putting down about Maduro's future. There was an oil quarantine that the United States had imposed along with the intensification of sanctions. But really, even despite all of that, it was still shocking to see that the United States had sent in a team of elite special operators, Delta Force soldiers, to essentially capture the Venezuelan president and his wife from their residence in Caracas and hustle them onto a U.S. aircraft where they were taken to New York to face charges on drug trafficking and other alleged crimes. So just kind of the boldness of this action in a foreign country without any sort of green light from Congress. And, I think there was widespread consensus within the international community and certainly the American political establishment that Maduro was not a legitimate leader. He manipulated the most recent elections in Venezuela and was an incredibly oppressive leader and oversaw kind of a destruction of the Venezuelan state and economy. But still, to see U.S. troops taking this action in a very bold way in another country was very surprising and shocking for a lot of the president's critics and I think even some of his supporters.
What do we know, Missy, about why it happened when it happened?
Well, the president had planned it for at least 3 months. That's what the military leaders said after the fact. We do know that there had been on and off attempts since the beginning of the Trump administration to broker some kind of managed exit for Nicolas Maduro. They had floated the idea of some sort of exile for him. And the essentially Maduro kind of called their bluff, wrongly so, as it seems in retrospect. But I think Trump, decided that now was the time to act against him, and that it was time, in his view, to really reclaim the oil that had been stolen, as he has put it, although that's not really the case, and to do away with a dictator who had sort of been a bête noire for him in the Western Hemisphere, in a country that's right across the Caribbean.
Were the military teams that planned and carried out the raid pleasantly surprised by this quick and clean outcome, or was that the result that they had predicted they could deliver from the start?
Um, in some ways, it was a very risky operation. You're talking about inserting a team of several dozen special operators into the foreign capital. Venezuela does have significant air defense systems that it's obtained from Russia and other places. So that is a huge challenge. Nobody knew exactly what they were going to encounter. He was very famously guarded by these Cuban kind of personal presidential guard, if you will. But on the other hand, Venezuela's military is incredibly corrupt. It's a decayed military power, if you will. So in that sense, it's not going up against a country like Iran, or certainly any kind of near peer competitor like Russia. So the depth of the Venezuelan military was not significant, and in fact, they faced very little opposition, or they faced from the kind of more advanced air defenses as they went in. It was kind of a narrow miss in one sense, because there was shooting that happened as they came in and approached by helicopter, and one of the helicopter pilots was actually shot in the leg. They managed to all get out safely, but you could imagine what had happened if that incident had gone a different way. You could have had a helicopter crash, and we would be having a very different conversation right now had that occurred.
Among U.S. leaders who disapproved of the operation at the time, and beyond the operation itself, what were the complications in the aftermath that they worried might happen as a result?
Well, I mean, the real concerns were some sort of Iraq type situation. And that's what we heard from a number of different members of Congress. That was the biggest, and that obviously would be a drain on America's human and fiscal resources, not to mention a distraction from the real kind of strategic national threats that the United States needs to get after, namely China. And so that was the biggest thing we heard about. And then, there was also concerns about kind of the president exceeding his constitutional authority in launching this operation. You'll remember that the Trump administration labeled this a kind of simple law enforcement operation, I think is what Marco Rubio called it, because they said there was an indictment that dated back to 2020, I believe, for Maduro. And, and as I said, everybody agreed that Maduro was a bad leader, that he was illegitimate. But the fact that Trump decided to use the military in this way was kind of a different story. But the biggest concern really is that this was going to turn into another chaos, Iraq-style chaos, and violent, ongoing insurgent type situation.
Okay, we have to say 4 months on, life in Venezuela seems pretty normal. But how relative is the term normal when applied to Venezuela in the 2020s?
Yeah, I talked to a number of people there on the ground in Caracas, and they said, look, and these are people who had many of the same expectations that the Democrats and President Trump's critics had, that this really could turn into a conflagration. And they said, that the economy is still terrible. There are still the kind of lack of services and normal governance functioning. But on the other hand, the economy has started to stabilize. The exchange rate is still poor, and prices are still high, but there is very little insecurity in the country. And the interim government, basically what Trump did was take out Maduro, the head of the snake, if as they would have called him, and left in charge as number two Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president. She's now become the interim leader, and basically everybody beneath her. Those authorities have kind of dialed back the repression in the last 4 months. They've let hundreds of prisoners out of jail, political prisoners. There are many more still in jail, but they have kind of laid off some of the worst, most heavy handed repressive tactics that the administration, that the regime in Venezuela is known for in terms of rounding up people indiscriminately at protests, in terms of torture, in terms of some of the things that happened even in the first days after Maduro's ouster, which included stopping people on the streets and looking for signs that they had on their phone any sort of criticism of Maduro, and arresting them. The Trump administration has leaned on them to halt some of these things. They've placed a lot of emphasis on the release of political prisoners in particular, and so what the administration is doing is saying, you have to take certain steps, and we are not going to give you the money that your oil is getting when it's sold on the international market unless you meet our criteria. And that's sort of the balance that the interim authorities in Venezuela are doing right now, which is that I think they're kind of being forced into take a modicum of reforms, but at the same time they have gone much, much less far than the advocates of full democracy and certainly the Venezuelan opposition would like.
Why are U.S. leaders content to have Delcy Rodriguez in the top spot for now, even beyond the sort of limited time that an interim president is supposed to be acting? Like, how different is she in demeanor, in philosophy, in governance than her boss was?
Well, she's definitely cut from the same revolutionary cloth as Maduro, but the difference, I think, with Delcy and with Maduro is that she is willing to subordinate those principles or those beliefs to survival and to working with this regime. She is working closely with the Trump administration. She has had regular communication with Marco Rubio personally. She has conceded to an arrangement where the United States gets the proceeds of Venezuelan oil sales. Remember, it has the world's largest proven oil reserve, so this is a significant amount of money. So she has acceded to their demands to essentially allow the United States to take that money, put it in a bank account in the United States, and then the Trump administration will give some of that money back to the government of Venezuela when it gets and reviews kind of budget and spending requests from Delcy and her government.
So her compliance is as much about a pragmatic calculation of her own political survival as anything else.
100%. I do think there's also some acknowledgement that this is the only feasible path to economic recovery for Venezuela. Under this, the Venezuela is, right now poised to have a huge surge in economic growth because now, number one, the Trump administration has lifted sanctions, so Venezuela can sell its oil more widely. It's no longer required to sell it at a big discount in order to get around those sanctions. There are now new international companies coming in and signing additional oil deals, albeit at less kind of like under less nationalistic terms, more kind of common international terms, but those deals are still happening. And then, of course, as I said, because of the high oil sanctions. So all of this allows Venezuela to participate more fully in the global economy. And that actually is going to be good for Venezuelans.
Missy, Rodriguez's term as interim leader was technically set for 90 days. That period has come and gone. If it is likely to take months or even years before Maduro stands trial in the United States, what can we know about who will be running the country day to day until then?
I mean, my assumption is that it's going to be Delcy Rodriguez for the foreseeable future until there are elections. What has been very clear in this whole situation is that the Trump administration, I think, led by Marco Rubio, because he's the person who is the point official for Latin America, and obviously he has advocated extensively over many years for a change, political change in Venezuela. They are prioritizing stability far, far above kind of the immediate steps to restore any sort of robust democracy. My sense is that President Trump own priorities lay heavily in oil. And, we say in the article that President Trump referenced oil 19 times in the press conference that he gave the morning after Maduro's ouster, and barely talked about democracy and the kind of restoration of political rights that had animated Rubio, over many years of talking about Venezuela. I think, but for the oil sector and of course mining and critical minerals and all of that to flourish, I think that what the consensus view among Trump and his senior advisors is that stability is what's required to have those things flourish. And so and also on the democracy front, I think that many of them were chastened by what happened in places like Iraq or Libya, where they thought that a rush to elections and bringing in sometimes external opposition figures or parties kind of led to a fracturing of the country. And so what they're doing is betting on a more gradual process. And so that's why they're talking about elections in 2027. And, that is surprising. It was very surprising to me. I think it was surprising to people who saw the relationship that Rubio himself had with Maria Corina Machado, who's the head of Vente Venezuela, which is the most powerful opposition movement, the one that won the 2024 elections. And so, she had been kind of positioning herself, and it was widely assumed that she would be kind of going right back in any moment that Maduro was ousted, and that she would either kind of inherit or her party would inherit the role as rightful leaders, given what happened with the election results in 2024, or that she would be positioned to kind of take over some kind of interim government. And that's certainly what she was advocating for. So, but to the contrary, what Trump and Rubio have done is asked her to kind of stay outside of Venezuela. And I think there's some tension there in what she wants to do in terms of going back more quickly and kind of reclaiming her role as the person on the ground. She was, very courageously remained in Venezuela when many other opposition figures left she was there for several years, and she only left last year to get the Nobel Peace Prize. So there's some tension there in the between a quicker transition to democracy, which is something that, kind of rhetorically has been the reason why the United States has done many of these operations, and what this administration is doing now, which is a calculation on slow and steady, and then hopefully getting to that. I mean, the critics will say, well, this kind of belies the fact that Trump only really cared about oil and that democracy kind of wasn't even on the agenda. I think it probably differs which administration official you're talking about. I think Rubio, certainly for his future as a political figure, potential presidential candidate, will have to show that he can deliver democracy, a more authentic, legitimate democracy for Venezuela sometime in the future. But if that is 2027, he may manage to be able to retain the kind of credible claim to that if it goes well. But we just don't know. There's also a possibility it could stall, and that nobody ever takes over for Delcy Rodriguez, or maybe there's a return to kind of more acute protest or a social movement, or if the economy doesn't pan out as planned. I think Venezuelans are deeply, deeply frustrated by their quality of life concerns, and that could be a real crucial factor as well.
What about Edmundo Gonzalez, who ran in 2024 against Maduro, claims to have received more than 80% of the votes? Where is he in all this?
He is less of a prominent figure than Machado. They're from the same political movement, and so she was prohibited from running in that election, and so that's why he ended up being the cabinet. But the assumption has been that if there is if there was going to be some sort of opposition-led interim government, or if there's going to be an election in the near term, that she would be the candidate, not Edmundo Gonzalez.
What, if anything, could the United States do to compel Venezuela to hold like real elections? If they're slated for 2027, how much pressure can the United States apply to ensure that the actual winner is the person who receives the presidency?
Well, I mean, the United States has a huge amount of leverage right now, and they can, apply not limitless, but a huge amount of pressure because they control the oil reserves right now. They control the entire, most of the income that the federal government uses to operate, that the government uses to operate, and also they have the threat hanging over the head of Delcy Rodriguez and the senior people running the Venezuelan government that they could, again, be kidnapped out of their houses in the middle of the night by Delta Force or whoever. And many of them were under indictment before, and those indictments, could be a few of them have been lifted, but like they could be, or some of the sanctions have been lifted, but those people could be arrested at any time. And that those two things combined, I think, are very powerful leverage. So I think that Trump is definitely calling the shots here, at least on a kind of macro level. Whether or not the elections are credible and fair once they actually occur, I do think that they would have a lot of leverage when the elections actually happen, for those same reasons. But and there of course would be observers, and they're going to be able to set the conditions in a way that didn't happen in 2024. But I mean, it's still another country, and all of it depends, I think, on also the political will that Trump is willing to expend, and the bandwidth that the administration has at that time. It's still a ways off, and who knows what will be happening in the American political scene by then.
Mm. Is there any reason to suspect Rodriguez herself was aware that her boss was targeted for imminent removal? I mean, there's been some speculation that someone on the inside helped the United States carry out this operation to remove Maduro.
Yeah, that has not been really nailed down. I mean, again, yes, there is speculation that there were some back channeling. Clearly, there was infiltration of the government and and the people around Maduro to some extent, just given how the operation went and the intelligence the United States has had about Maduro, his whereabouts, what they were going to encounter when they got to Caracas. I remember they brought kind of breaching equipment with them to get Maduro out from behind this what seemed kind of like a safe room, or a big metal door or something like that. They seemed well prepared, but we don't know exactly who among the inner circle might have helped them. It could obviously have been the security folks as well. But Delcy's behavior post ouster suggests that she certainly may have been aware, because she very quickly kind of flipped and was willing to work with the United States in a way that would have been anathema to kind of the Chavista zeitgeist.
If presumably a very large majority of Venezuelan adults voted in 2024 to oust Maduro, even though he refused to leave, he is now gone. I mean, how do Venezuelans feel about the U.S. operation to remove the person who claimed to be their president?
Yeah, I think it's very complicated. So the people in Venezuela, polls that, in the polling that has been done since the ouster, there is a level of optimism that Venezuelans are expressing. That, we in our article cite a poll from Atlas Intel and Bloomberg that shows nearly 80% of Venezuelans think their country is either better off or the same as it was under Maduro. 54% said that greater U.S. influence was positive. 52% said the country's civil liberties have increased. So I think that, in the you can't understate the importance of the economic crisis there and hopes for that improving, and already that is improving to some extent. I do think that that will only kind of last for so long. So even if the economy stabilizes and people's day-to-day needs are being fulfilled, I think that at some point there's going to be desire for more political freedom, and so I think it's kind of a reflection of how bad things were in Venezuela and how hated Maduro was by many of the people there, that they were welcoming this kind of foreign intervention. I think I worked in Latin America for a long time as a reporter, and it's hard to overstate the long shadow of the United States and U.S. covert and overt involvement in Latin America, over the past few centuries. Everything from Cuba to Central America to Chile. That there's a lot of hangover of that, and Latin Americans are very eager to make their own decisions about their own countries. But the fact that Maduro was so bad, I think the fact that many people are saying, yes, it's good that the US is involved is just an indication of how bad things were under Maduro. And I think the flip side of this conversation is the complicating factor for people in the United States, and how do you, especially for Democrats, in talking about what happened in Venezuela, because on one hand, Democrats are very critical of President Trump's decision to launch this operation, especially without permission from Congress, especially in the way that they framed it as a law enforcement operation. But on the other hand, nobody likes Maduro, and they don't want to be seen as standing up for Maduro. They also have constituents who are happy that he's gone and want to go back to Venezuela. I think that there's another complicating factor here, which is Cuba. And we talked to people who are familiar with the Cuban American community in South Florida. I talked to one member of Congress who represents South Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and she was saying, the Cuban Americans that she represents are not going to be satisfied with the kind of superficial political change that occurred in Venezuela when it comes to Cuba. So I do think that President Trump and his advisors kind of drew some lessons from Venezuela, that they can use the military force to they can use the U.S. military to have these kind of quick one and done successes and enact political change in other countries. But number one, that kind of narrow change is not going to be palatable for Cuba. And number two, I think we're seeing in Iran that it's not always possible to use the military tool to get a strategic political kind of change or transformation that you may have wanted.
You quote an analyst you spoke with named Phil Gunson, who has lived in Caracas for a very long time now. He likens Venezuela in this post-Maduro era to an unexploded bomb. What does he mean by that?
I think he means that, again, as we were talking about earlier, Venezuelans are willing to show patience right now. They're willing to allow some time to see what happens to their daily lives, to their economic situations get better. They're willing to see if the combination of U.S. oversight and a kind of rump Maduro regime make things better for them. But there are still lots of volatile, combustible elements within Venezuelan society. You have a very corrupt and security service, the armed forces and the security services. You have lots of gangs. You have lots of drug running. You have a big and hard to control country that is next to another country that has a long history of rebel, guerrilla, and paramilitary violence. So, and you have a population that has shown itself willing to turn out in the streets in massive numbers to challenge the status quo, the political status quo, like we saw in 2019 when Juan Guaido tried to topple the Maduro regime. So there's a lot of combustible elements there. And I guess I should mention as well, there's also a history of U.S. adversaries kind of at least being present and supportive of the Venezuelan authorities. That includes Iran and Russia, and so there's a lot of things that could go wrong there, and that's what Phil's talking about.
I mean, what role could the U.S. play in defusing or detonating that bomb?
I think that what they're trying to do is prevent any sort of explosion by having a gradual change, by prioritizing stability. Their hope is that as the economy improves, that'll kind of buy them some time and allow for a more gradual transition. And I think that I talked to people who said, yeah, like that's a reasonable assumption. If you had brought somebody like Machado back right away, that she's a kind of hardline figure. It would have been harder for her to compromise and work with the existing security force leaders, for example, or they could have fractured the state. Was the least likely to result in a fracturing of the state that we saw in Iraq and we saw in Libya, for example.
Missy, I want to go back to the oil question. As you mentioned, Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. As I understand it, though, in early days after the removal of Maduro, President Trump was talking a lot about seizing a lot of that oil. U.S. oil companies, though, were somewhat reluctant to race back into trying to do business in Venezuela. What caused them to end operations there in the first place, and sort of what is the state of American business now with regard to Venezuelan oil?
Yeah, so the Chavista authorities had expropriated oil assets in years past, and had put in kind of nationalistic rules, like the PDVSA, the National Minerals Company, had to have a majority stake. So there were lots of things like that were disadvantageous to foreign companies, excuse me. And Exxon would famously say that it had its holdings taken not once but twice over the last 50 years in Venezuela. But they are coming back, in some ways, not all of them. And Exxon did say that Venezuela was uninvestable. There have been some deals that have been signed, not the kind of big production deals that I think were hoped for initially, because the oil companies they don't just need a change in one person in the government. What these companies need in order to do big new investments is a blueprint for stability, is a blueprint for rule of law. Arbitration is a blueprint for saying, after President Trump leaves office, or in 3 years when they stop pressuring Delcy Rodriguez, or whatever the political change will be in Venezuela, that we're not going to have our assets taken again. And so it's a much more complicated and it's a much higher bar for having the kind of big investments that are going to transform the economy. I talked to some oil experts who said that rather than the kind of production increases that Trump has been talking about, to kind of double the oil output, or going back to the heyday of the 90s, that instead they're looking at increasing it by 300,000 barrels a day from roughly 1 million barrels a day now. So that's a modest increase. I think combined with the high oil prices, that could still make a big difference in Venezuelans' lives and in the government's ability to provide services and all of that, which is crucial. But it's not the kind of overnight sensation that I think the Trump administration had been hoping to see.
Government services and overall economic conditions in Venezuela are still, nothing to envy. I understand why an authoritarian government had not felt pressed to do a whole lot for its citizens for many years. It is less obvious to me why, with all that oil, Venezuelans have struggled to get by financially. Can you help us understand how, like with all those natural resources, widespread prosperity has not happened?
Well, I mean, the way it's been described to me is a combination of sanctions and corruption and mismanagement. You know, the oil facilities in Venezuela are famously decrepit, poorly maintained, investments that, weren't kept up. There is a huge amount of corruption in the state. And, the sanctions were significant. That meant that in recent years, basically Venezuela could only sell to China in like a shadow fleet. That means that they sold at a significant discount. So when you have all those, and there was also a significant brain drain in Venezuela, and millions of people emigrating. So all of those conditions together, I think, help explain why a country that really used to be. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, you had people from Chile, from countries all throughout Latin America going to work in Venezuela because the wages were higher, the economy was much better than anywhere else. And now you have the opposite. For I worked in Peru for several years. That is a much historically much poorer country than Venezuela. And now you have Venezuelans emigrating to Peru to try to get jobs, which is just kind of shocking if you think about the history of that. So it's really a tragedy of economic potential being frittered away in a sense, and it's really resulted in a fracturing of the society as well, just because so many people have left, and that has brought with it so many sad consequences.
What are the biggest impediments to American gains from its new influence on the oil sector in Venezuela? Like, how could Russia and China cause problems with President Trump's plan to enrich this country with Venezuelan oil?
Well, I don't know that they have so much control over that. I mean, as we say in our article, there are the Russian and Chinese state oil companies do hold stakes in Venezuela's oil sector. I think they together account for 22% of the oil production. And I think that the Trump administration is going to have to find a way to push them out of those contracts, either sell them or revoke them or something like that. But other than that, these countries have limited tools. The United States is much closer. They had only their influence had really only gained in recent decades as the United States was estranged from Venezuela and was less involved. The Russian military, there's a reason why, in recent decades was playing such a big role is because the United States wasn't there. I don't expect either of them to be able to be a major spoiler.
The Trump administration has a lot going on in the world at this moment. How much attention and energy is available, including from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who seems really invested in the fate of Venezuela? How much energy is available to manage this new relationship?
That's a great question. And that, it's funny because at the beginning of the year, we were so focused on Venezuela. The reason why we ended up doing this article a few weeks ago was that it was just striking to us that it has kind of fallen out of the headlines. And in some ways, I think that's a measure of the fact that it has exceeded the expectations of many of Trump's critics, and that it has been kind of quiet. So it hasn't been in the news for that reason. And then obviously we've had other things going on, like the war in Iran, for example. But the fact that the Trump administration is now mired in this kind of is it on, is it off conflict with Iran is, it is a bandwidth factor that is real. My understanding is that Marco Rubio at the beginning was talking several times a week directly to Delcy Rodriguez. Now the engagement is much more dispersed across the government. You have people reviewing the spending request. You have the Interior Secretary Burgum was down there recently to talk to mining executives. You have the Southcom commander went down. There are lobbyists who are going down from, people from the private sector. So it's now much more spread out across the government, and that to some extent relieves the bandwidth problem. But when it comes to the big questions of how much pressure they're willing to put on Delcy Rodriguez to actually follow through with delivering on the kind of democratic milestones that eventually you have to think that Trump is going to, or at least Rubio will try to make them meet. That to me is one of the big questions, because it certainly hasn't happened yet. Venezuelans may be okay with that for now, just having this economic improvement, but eventually, the United States will have to apply that pressure to get real elections, real freedom of expression, and all of those things that will make this kind of what it was sold as back in January.
Yeah, you note that the three stages that Marco Rubio sees for Venezuela are stabilization, recovery, and transition. We've talked about this stabilization phase, which I suppose is ongoing. What do recovery and transition look like? Like, what, in terms of transition, what is the ultimate goal?
Transition. So, they say now they've entered the recovery stage, and that I think is really investment and recovering the economy, having more income coming into the country, and then having that flow out across the Venezuelan economy, and ideally have positive, beneficial impacts to normal people. The transition is the elections, and that is a kind of blank box because I think it's so far off. And the opposition has detailed plans for what they think needs to happen with the national election authorities and redoing the registry of Venezuelans inside and outside the country in order to be able to hold election. I mean, these are not insignificant things when you're talking about millions of people who have left the country or been, displaced within their own country. And then holding the elections and making sure they're fair. That all of that last part, that bucket of transition, is off in the future for the Trump administration, as far as I can tell. It's only the middle of 2026, not even May 2026. So if we're talking about things happening in the second half of 2027, they've got a long way to go.
How much freedom of information of the press is there in Venezuela?
Not much for Venezuelans. There are foreign reporters, but my understanding is that they're not giving visas to foreign reporters who are not currently in Venezuela. There is still, there is some surveillance that continues to occur of university students, who are seen as more politically active. There have been, as we were talking about earlier, there have been releases of, several hundred at least political prisoners. The government seems to overstate those numbers, but we went. There are kind of NGO or watchdog organizations that track that more closely. But some of those people are subject to kind of conditional release, that they can't travel, they can't talk to the media. So it certainly has not been a return to a real democracy or a robust democracy in any way. And so that is you have to grade them on that 100%. But there are steps in the right direction. And, I think what Trump and his critics will argue about is the adequacy of those steps and how much sense it makes to not put more pressure on Delcy Rodriguez and her authorities to go faster.
If we can broadly characterize Venezuela now as better, if very much still a work in progress, do you find President Trump's critics are willing to acknowledge that success and support ongoing American involvement to finish the job?
To a certain extent, I feel like they will say he kind of got lucky here. And that for me, there were two main goals for Trump. One was avoiding an Iraq-style chaos insurgency. And second was the oil. Actually, I think oil was the first one for President Trump. And the second was, avoiding a quagmire type situation. but democracy does not seem to have featured highly, if at all, on his list of priorities. I do think that, his critics are calling him on that, calling him on the, discrepancy between, the rhetoric that Marco Rubio had for many years. Like, they I think will say, okay, this didn't go well. But, this didn't go as badly as we might have thought. He got lucky, and allow him to think that he can get away with this for next time. And then that's where they point to Iran. The tactical success that the Trump administration had in the 12-day war, in Midnight Hammer in June of last year in Iran, of the operation in Venezuela in January, really contributed to the confidence that the president had in launching this much larger operation in Iran, and it has not gone well. Venezuela helped make him feel more confident in his foreign policy instincts, and that's just not playing out in the same way in Iran.
Missy Ryan is a staff writer at The Atlantic, where you can read her article, Venezuela Seems to Be Going Well. Missy, I really appreciate the time you made for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.
From PRX.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.